This week's episode of the Rural Woman Podcast is brought to you by the patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast. This amazing group of individuals contribute financially to the Rural Woman Podcast to ensure the stories of women in agriculture hit your earbuds each and every week. Want to join them in supporting the stories of women in agriculture while getting access to extended episodes, patron-only episodes, and other great perks? Head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more about how you can become a patron through Patreon. Hi, I'm Caitlin Dubin, and this is the Rural Woman Podcast. I'm a first-generation farmer who married into agriculture. Born and raised in a city, I was so unfamiliar with where my food came from, but I was determined to figure it out. Through my journey into agriculture, I saw women who were strong but humble, often taking a back seat. To me, these women were leaders who deserved a seat at the table. I created the Rural Woman Podcast to share the voices of women in an industry whose stories often went untold. The rural entrepreneurs who live and breathe their work, full of grit and pride. We come here to share our stories, to be in community with each other, to be challenged and inspired, but most importantly, to be celebrated and to be heard. We may not all live, farm, ranch, or homestead the same, but we are all connected. We are rural women, and our stories are worthy of being told. Hey friends, we are celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Rural Women Podcast this year, and we are taking a look back through the inspiring stories that have been shared with us throughout the years. Looking back through these interviews, there are women who have been successful, who have persevered, and who have been resilient. There are women who have shared their stories who may not farm or ranch or homestead or work in the business that they used to. Things may be different for them now, but I know their stories have impact. And I hope that this is a solid reminder for those of you who have shared your stories or who are inspired to share your stories. Our stories are forever changing, and just because we may not farm, ranch, or homestead the same, our lives might not look the same. There has been growth here. Through the good, the bad, and the ugly, I think it's a solid reminder for all of us to look back to see how far we've come. So my friends, I hope you enjoy these throwback podcast episodes coming your way, and thank you for being here and for helping me celebrate the incredible stories of women in agriculture through the Rural Woman Podcast over the last 5 years. Enjoy.
For the listeners who are unfamiliar with you, give us some information about yourself. Who are you and where are you from?
So my name is Nicole Vernon. I'm 34 years old, and I am the co-owner of Vernon Family Farm, which is a pastured poultry farm in Newfields, New Hampshire. Newfields is a small town on the seacoast of New Hampshire. We're about 20 minutes outside of Portsmouth. My first job, besides being a mom and a farmer and a wife, is being a Spanish teacher. So I sort of have an interesting background as far as what my farming experience is and how I got involved in farming. I spend a lot of time off the farm, a lot of time on the social media handles that we run. And in the summer, I'm usually running around the fields with my girls, sort of popping in and out of our farm store and doing other farmy things.
So tell us more about how you found and started the farm that you're on now, Vernon Family Farm.
So Jeremiah, he's always been into agriculture, right? He grew up in New London, New Hampshire. He grew up on a piece of property that has been in his family for generations. He had chickens and ducks and goats and sheep and a little bit of everything. He really had like that typical homesteading experience with his family. He had a love for animals, and he went to Bates College. He graduated with a degree in biology. He got into working on different farms and having different farming experiences. We met And he pursued those farming experiences and continued those farming experiences. And we sort of dreamed together that we would, at one point, buy a piece of property and start farming it. We didn't really understand what that meant at the time. We didn't really understand what that looked like, but we are two very social beings. We're two very emotional, very excited people, we're very gregarious and outgoing, and we usually dream big. And so the thing that was really helpful in Jeremiah's experience, and it sort of led us both to, starting Vernon Family Farm together, was his experience specifically on a sheep and goat farm. He worked for a farm called Riversley Farm, which is just down the road from where we live today. And that farming experience gave him a really neat opportunity because he was running their farmers markets. And he got to sort of observe during those farmers markets where the holes were in the local food system, where gaps were. And one thing that he realized was that, there's a lot of farmers coming together at these farmers markets, but nobody's really selling chicken. People are selling chicken in very small quantities. People are only selling chicken, as like a broiler, as a whole bird. But nobody is selling chicken in the typical cuts that you get from the supermarket. Nobody's selling boneless breast. Nobody's selling drumsticks or wings, thighs. And so that sort of got him thinking about poultry more seriously. And we started raising chickens. This was about 7 years ago at Riversley Farm. We started out with a very small amount of chicken. 5-6 years ago, we were raising 1,200 chicken, and now we're raising 20,000 chicken during a pastured poultry season.
On this week's episode, you'll meet Amanda Volsen.
For my listeners who are unfamiliar with you, give us some information about who you are and where you're from.
Sure. So I live in south central Minnesota, just near the Iowa border. I married my husband, Eric, about 10 years ago this next year, and he is a 6th-generation farmer. So we work with his parents, my in-laws. We farm together but separate. We raise corn and soybeans. We're also integrating a third crop rotation in the last couple of years, my husband has moved towards some more soil health sustaining practices. We also have cattle. We raise 4 kids, ages 8, 7, 5, and 3. So that keeps life very interesting. We've got some cows, some chickens, raise a big garden. We do maple syrup in the spring. I'm also a registered nurse, volunteer EMT, photographer. Life is very full here in southern Minnesota.
We mentioned this a little bit before, but you also do photography as well. So tell us more about your photography business and how that all got started and why you started it.
Sure. Yeah, so as a young girl, I can remember just loving magazines like Country and Farm and Ranch. Like, I would love when they would come, and I would just look at all these pictures. And so it was, even at a young age, my love for photography was tied in with this agriculture, because a lot of those pictures in those magazines are to do with ag. So I have always appreciated when a picture can evoke emotion and connection, and it creates a feeling. And so in high school, my aunt passed down one of her old cameras to me, and I just started taking pictures, and it has just slowly built from there. I've been taking pictures last 15 plus years probably, and just kind of learning as I have gone along. Not ever had any formal training, but like I said, I just love sharing our story through pictures. And I think it's one of the ways that I advocate for agriculture, remind people that there are families. There's still family farms, and this is what it looks like, and to help people connect in that way in seeing the pictures that I share. So I take pictures of just the rural landscape. I take pictures of our family. I do sessions for seniors and families and little kids, and it also allows for a fair amount of flexibility. But I think like my dream role as a photographer would be to travel and tell the stories of these farming and ranching families across the country, and to just, there's so much that can be told in just the everyday things that we do.
On this week's episode, you will meet my friend and fellow farmer, Dana Penrice.
So for my listeners who are not familiar with you like I am, give us a little bit of information about who you are and where you're from.
Sure. So my name's Dana, and I am from Lacombe, Alberta originally, but right now I'm living at Shoal Lake, Manitoba. And yeah.
So let's talk about this wonderful organization that you are a part of and what your role is there. First, let's talk about what the heck is a young agrarian.
Sure. So sometimes we get a little bit tripped up with our name because of the word young. Basically, a young agrarian is anybody who's like just starting out in farming. They might be interested in farming but haven't yet done anything yet. Most of our all of our network is interested in kind of ecological agriculture and that big umbrella of what that is. So things like permaculture, holistic management, organic farming, kind of natural farming, sustainable farming, all of those different things. And our young agrarians are very interested in community and building community around them, kind of serving their community through their farms. But really what we're looking at with young agrarians, like our audience is anybody who's kind of like even backyard gardeners who are kind of like just trying to, grow their own food all the way out to bigger scale farms who are, doing some really cool things in direct marketing, say into Calgary. There's a variety of people in the Young Agrarians Network, variety of ages. We did a survey of new and young farmers across Canada with National Farmers Union in 2015, and we were trying to capture kind of aspiring farmers because those people aren't captured in kind of the Statistics Canada stuff. We captured kind of over 1,300 people, and out of them, the age range was from 18 to 80. So that's where the word young doesn't really work, but it's young at heart is what we go with. And a lot of them are women. So part of that survey, we found that like 58% of our respondents were women. In that survey, we really found too, like that people are really motivated by kind of values-based farming. So yeah, like I said, that interest in like doing better for the planet, doing better for the community. They want to be, working for themselves and independent.
On this week's episode, you'll meet Annessa Good.
For my listeners who are unfamiliar with you, give us a little bit of information about who you are and where you're from.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Annessa. I was born and raised on a mixed farm near Cremona, Alberta, just north of Cochrane. And my family raised purebred Simmental cattle and Timothy alfalfa hay to Japan. So we are definitely hay country, close to the foothills. And my dad, alongside my grandpa, were one of the first importers of Simmental cattle into Canada in the 60s. So definitely near and dear to my heart there. I have since moved back home to the family farm a couple of years ago, and all of a sudden there's a couple Angus running in our field, so that's been an adjustment for our family, but it's a good time for sure.
So tell us how you started down the path of where you are now and your career in succession planning.
So I definitely had born and raised in it as well, for sure. So my dad, Merle Good, he worked for the Alberta government as the provincial agriculture tax specialist for his career in succession planning. So every night, when we'd have supper together, when he wasn't doing his full-time other two jobs of purebred cattle and exporting hay, when we did get to have supper together at the table, he would talk about the families he'd met and what they worked through. And I just always remember thinking what a cool job that you get to help people, you get to meet people from all over, and really my passion preserving the legacy of the family farm and agriculture. And so, kind of stereotypical, that's what my dad did, so that wasn't necessarily what I was going to do. It almost seemed too easy, right, to step into that. So went and found myself for a couple of years and then kind of went, this is actually what I really want to do. So was very blessed that my parents let me come back to the family farm. So I'm in the succession roller coaster myself, living, breathing it with our transition plan, and then got to work with Dad, meeting with families. So it was great.
That's awesome. I know succession planning can be such a hot button topic for a lot of people. And myself included. I am in the roller coaster of what will be succession planning eventually for our own farm. So what I wanted to do, and this is a conversation that I've had with multiple women over the last couple years, and I'm super excited to have you on the show because this is a lot of times what people are talking about when it comes to succession planning and transition planning and all of the things. So I actually have quite the easy job today. I didn't come up with the questions that I'm going to ask you. What I did was I headed on over to the Rural Women Podcast community group on Facebook, where there are over 400 women in this community with one another, and I posted the question, and I simply said to them, I said, ladies, I'm interviewing a succession planning specialist tomorrow morning for an upcoming episode on the podcast. Would you happen to have any questions that you would like answered? And Annessa, I kid you not, I have never gotten so much response to a question that I have posed to this group. So it is obviously something that is on the minds of a lot of people in agriculture, and a lot of people have a lot of questions about it. So what I'm going to do is I am just going to pull some of the questions that I received, because if I ask you all of them, we would be here all day. So first of all, my first question to you is, where on earth do you even start with succession planning? What are some of the simple ways that you start and kind of dip your toe into this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely one of those where, it just feels like it's a mountain and how to even start. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about it. Is just a little bit of background, I guess. One of the things I think that's missing in succession planning, which is why I became so passionate about joining my dad's company, was I would go into all these seminars and conferences, and everyone looked like my dad. They had, sorry, Dad, graying white hair, right? And they were talking to the senior generation. And I was sitting in the crowd thinking, hold it. The decisions that those senior generations make impact my future, my family, all of these things. So my goal today is we're going to talk a lot about that junior generation's perspective and providing a voice for them at the table. That's what I'm really passionate about. So in saying that, when it comes to how do we even start, where do we start, I now work for Farm Credit Canada, FCC, and I'm really excited that they're rolling out this new program where they have put advisors, transition advisors across the country to start the conversations, because that's the hardest part. So I'm not an accountant, I'm not a lawyer, and our job is just to bring the families together to the table and start the conversation, because it's pretty easy to bring up to a mother-in-law, a father-in-law, for example. The other reason I'm very passionate about succession planning is because I lived it and breathed it. I think you're a succession advisor if you either went through some traumatic experiences and wanted that from happening to other people, or you had a really good experience and want to show people how it can be done. I haven't met an advisor that's kind of in the middle, and I'm definitely on the spectrum where my family has went through a lot of pain and suffering over it. So sometimes having that neutral third party to start the conversation, looking up neutral resources. It's obviously not able to meet a person face-to-face, saying, hey, I went online, I found this resource. This isn't my question. It is the internet's question, right? Even though it's the question you want to ask. So definitely trying to rely on neutral third-party resources as much as we can, I think, is a good way to initially start. It's going to get more personal. It's going to get more individualized as it progresses, but just to bring it up, I think.
You can help support the stories of women in agriculture to be shared through the Rural Woman podcast on Patreon. What is Patreon? It's a membership-based platform that helps fund and support creators like me to create and produce content like this that you all love. New to the Rural Woman podcast Patreon is ad-free listening and patron-only bonus content and exclusive episodes. Learn more and join the patron gang today at patreon.com/The Rural Woman Podcast.
So my name is Laurie Trigg, and I am from Marithorpe, Alberta. I am a mom of 3, and we raise bison, pork, and chickens.
And the bison is obviously the thing here that I want to talk a lot about, because I don't know anything about them. And I'm sure I'm not the only one. And it's not something that's, typically common. It's usually cattle and pig and sheep and whatever else. But I'm so excited to dig more into your knowledge on bison and how you guys started into that. So, Laurie, tell us more about raising them and what that experience is like.
So I guess when I was adamant that we would raise beef, I thought that they would be so much easier because I was raised around it. Chad was raised around them, and I was like, we're very experienced in them. So we are first-generation bison farmers. We were not experienced with them at all. We have a really good friend that had bison, and he said, you guys have bison fencing. You should really, take this up kind of thing. So I just look at it and I'm like, oh, you can't really work bison on horses and stuff that much. You can. A lot of people do, but it is more dangerous. They're a very wild animal. They need to be treated as a wild animal. You can be put into situations that are pretty dangerous when you're working bison. But the beautiful thing about bison is because they are such a wild animal, there's no calving help for them. You are not out there in the middle of winter calving bison. So our herd, it may be different for different people in different parts of in the world or whatever, but our bison start calving at the end of May, and we had our first calf actually a couple weeks ago. It was just so cute. It was the earliest calf we've ever had, but they calve on their own. So typically our bison go into the bush. They have all of their calves. We don't see them for 2 weeks. And then they come back out with all of these calves. Bison also eat a lot less. They like to forage, whereas beef need that constant feed throughout the winter. And bison really like to forage and paw and just get their own food. They eat a lot of snow. Our bison, because they are in captivity, obviously, we have a watering bowl for them, and then we take them bales every couple days. And they're just really easygoing. They're really low maintenance. And for a family like ours, Chad typically works in the oil field, so he's away a lot of the time. And so a lot of this stuff is put on me to take care of animals. So they are just the perfect species for us to take care of, because with all the other small farm chores and stuff like that, they don't need a lot of help or a lot of assistance in what they're doing because they're just doing their own thing.
My name is Dallas James. I'm married to my husband, Doug, who's a police officer. I've got 3 kiddos. And right now we live in Port Perry, Ontario on our baby, brand new baby, family farm.
Take us on the journey of how James Family Farm came to be.
So, this is going to go back to before farming, but just to give the listeners a bit of an idea. My husband, maybe 7 years ago, came to me and said, you know what, babe, when we retire, I want to sail. And Caitlin, I tell you, this is the first time I had heard anything along those lines come out of his mouth. Never had I even heard the thought about sailing. But he told me that this was this dream of his. And so I replied, well, why would we wait till we retire? That's something we should do when we're young and capable, not, when we're worried about our health and safety and all that. So, of course, what do we do with the kids? How do we do this? Where do we go? All this sort of stuff. And I just have always had the attitude that if you want to do something, just figure out a way to do it and then start taking steps towards that. So we did. That's exactly what we did. We started planning. We found, Doug had to go get his captain's license. We found a safe area to sail. We talked to the kids' teachers and pulled them out of school. And we ended up renting a really small, old, somewhat decrepit sailboat, but we were able to spend just over a month sailing, living on the ocean in the British Virgin Islands with our 3 kids. And it was incredible. It just made us realize that life is meant to be lived. Dreams are meant to be chased. And, you know, the old adage, where there's a will, there's a way, it's absolutely true. We worked hard and saved for a few years, and all of our energy and passion went into this. And it was just life-changing to have this experience as a family. You know, it brought us closer together. And one of my favorite parts of it was because there was nothing to do. There was nowhere to go, and there was nothing to do other than just be in the present moment. So when our kids would hug us, we would just hug them without any other thought. You know, it was just magic. It was incredible and life-changing in so many ways. So I think when we got home from that and resettled back into life, a new dream started percolating in my heart, and that was the one of owning a farm.
I'm Julia Wells. I have a small family farm in central Oklahoma, but I'm originally from New Jersey, and we raise pastured poultry, pork, and grass-fed beef.
So let's dive into the homeschooling side of Julia Wells.
Yes.
Tell us how this whole homeschooling venture got started for you.
So we live rurally, as most people who farm do. And part of it was I didn't think my oldest son was quite mature enough to go to school. And the other part was I wasn't really impressed with the Oklahoma education system. And so we figured, well, do the homeschooling thing for a couple of years and see how it works out. And, you know, there's usually one parent who's kind of on the fence about it. And my husband had a bunch of people in his life who were like, oh, yeah, my kids are homeschooled. And, you know, you have that perception of like homeschoolers are weirdos that live in their parents' basement. And I think my husband a little bit had that preconceived notion. But when he found all these people who had kids that were like doctors and lawyers and architects and like, you know, had great jobs and went to college and had careers and weren't living in their parents' basement, he was like, oh. And he saw that the side that really interests him, and I definitely relate to it as well, is that, you know, our kids can work at their own pace. They can go ahead and they don't have to, you know, spend all their time in school. When they get older, they can do concurrent enrollment and get college courses or find a trade or work on their own schedule while they go to school. And that was very appealing for both of us.
For sure. And I have to say that I side a little bit with Caleb's preconceived notion of homeschooling, even here in Canada. It just wasn't something that I think my parents ever considered. So having that consideration in 2020, well, before 2020, let's say, is something that I think a lot of people had.
Yeah, it definitely is. And now that it's kind of our forced norm to some extent, I think people's eyes are going to open quite a bit as far as like the opportunities that it presents.
Yes, absolutely. On this week's episode, you'll meet Scarlett Salamone.
I am Scarlett, and I live in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, on a small dairy farm. We are a farm that does dairy a little different due to the fact that we aren't able to sell fluid milk or do any of the kind of larger dairy operation things. And so we're a small dairy farm doing it a little differently. We're focused on bringing young people and children to our farm in order to experience a working farm, particularly youth from the city, to give them that experience and opportunity in agriculture, to connect with animals, to connect with the land, and to kind of see how everything can work together.
So tell us how Loveland Acres started.
Yeah, crazily enough, it probably, if I were to be fully honest, it came to be out of depression. Probably at like the lowest of lows, desperation and praying and just wishing that life would quit being so miserable, I got the heart nudge to get goats. Like, who does that, right? But I do. So I got the heart nudge to get goats, and I started kind of doing a little bit of research. We had chickens here already, and so I thought maybe that would be kind of, a good distraction. It would be something for our kids to invest in and help take care of. And so I did the research, and through my research, I found, the benefits of actually drinking the milk. So, growing up, we raised livestock for the table, and to learn that you could milk goats and drink their milk, and that it was just really a nutritional powerhouse in a glass. That was very intriguing to me, considering I have a stomach disorder, a disease that doesn't allow me to really eat properly anymore. So in talking with my husband, I asked if we could get goats, told him, some reasons why. And of course he was all for it. And so next thing I knew, we were driving all over between Wisconsin and Illinois and getting a little starter goat herd together.
I am very excited to be kicking it off with the fancy lady herself, Courtenay DeHoff.
So I grew up in Kansas. I am from northeastern Kansas, sort of outside of Kansas City. My whole family is from there. Both of my mom and my dad grew up ranching and farming in Kansas. So agriculture was sort of bred into me. It's in my genetics. My grandparents still run a large cow-calf operation in the Flint Hills of Kansas. And I grew up showing Angus heifers. We showed Angus heifers all over the United States. And I also grew up rodeoing. So I high school rodeoed to the state of Kansas. I just had a really awesome childhood. Like, there were always show cattle in the barn. There were always great horses in the trailer. And I just was surrounded by amazing agriculture people my whole life. Cowboys and cowgirls were really all I had ever known. And it was just a really, really great childhood.
So in rodeo, what was your event? What was your sport?
Yeah, I did. So I was a barrel racer. I ran barrels. I also was a really great goat tyer. I went to the national high school finals, qualified in the goat tying. In college, I ran barrels and tied goats and did all of the things, as a freshman in college. It doesn't seem that strange to me, but I guess like my friends here in Dallas in the city just think it is the most interesting and bizarre thing. I rolled into Oklahoma State as a freshman in a truck and a trailer with 4 horses and 2 goats, and that was just normal for me as a 19-year-old, to take all my animals to school and, have to get up every morning and practice and, go to the school and practice and drive myself all over the Central Plains region, to college rodeos. But yeah, I ran barrels and tied goats. And then in college, I learned to rope as well. And I just really, really fell in love with roping, breakaway roping. And I lived on a cutting horse place. And he told me, he goes, when you can rope the bale 200 times in a row without missing, then you can get on a horse and, we'll start the logistics of roping off of a horse. And so I just waited until he went to work and I saddled up my horse and I loaded calves. And, he knew right off because there were tracks in the arena and he knew that I had put calves in and was trying to rope by myself. And so, that's sort of how I learned to rope and had some success in college. And it was a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to the Rural Woman Podcast. The Rural Woman Podcast is more than just a podcast. We are a community. A huge thank you to the Rural Woman Podcast team, audio editor Max Hofer, and admin support from Kim & Co. Online. A special thanks to our Patreon executive producers, Sarah Riedner from Happiness by the Acre and Carrie Munven from Laystone Farms. To learn how you can become a Patreon executive producer or other ways to financially support the show, head on over to wildrosefarmer.com to learn more. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast to get the latest episodes directly on your playlist. And if you are loving the show, please be sure to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or any other platform that accepts ratings and reviews. You can connect with us on social media at The Rural Woman Podcast and with me at Wild Rose Farmer. One of the best ways you can support the show is by sharing it. Send this episode to a friend or share on your social media. Let's strengthen and amplify the voices of women in agriculture together. Until next time, my friend, keep sharing your story. Did you know that you can get this same great episode of the Rural Woman Podcast ad-free? I get it. Listening to ads during a podcast isn't always my favorite either. But in order to keep the lights and coffee pot on here at the Rural Woman Podcast Studios, they are necessary. I am so grateful to each and every one of my sponsors, but if you yourself would like to skip the ads while supporting the show, consider joining me over on Patreon. Patrons of the Rural Woman Podcast get ad-free episodes starting at Tier 5 on their podcast player of choice each week, plus some other great benefits. Find out more by heading to the link in today's show notes to learn how you can become a patron through Patreon.